Hello, this is Jeremy Elkins with Untreated Art. In this episode, I'll be making a rustic copper dining table using deep pour resin and figured maple. I also added in a little bit of a twist on the live edges, so let's get into it and see how it turned out. I started out by visiting the local wood mill to see what slabs I could get. The client requested figured maple and wanted a decent amount of movement to the live edges. Luckily, I was able to find a pair of sister slabs cut from the same log that had burls on the live edges to get that movement the client wanted. The slabs were wide enough and actually a few feet longer than what I really needed, which is a good thing because it allows me to set them next to each other and move the live edges up and down to create the best forming river. When laying out the dimensions for the table over the top of the slabs, I always give it a few extra inches all the way around for the rough cuts. This ensures that when I get them back to the shop to make more accurate trim cuts, I have plenty of wiggle room to make adjustments as needed. After all the rough cuts are made, I put the slabs back into the configuration of the outline of the table just to get one last glance and make sure that everything looks good before moving on. The client asked for a rustic copper, which was going to be a solid pigment resin, so I wanted to try something new by burning the live edges to see what the outline would look once completed. This was for aesthetic purposes only and has nothing to do with the resin adhering to the live edge. I wanted to try and complement the darker colors in a rustic copper with this black outline of the resin river. Most of it would get covered up by the copper resin, but I planned on leaving an 1/8 inch of clearance at the top for clear resin so they would show through. I placed the slabs on a polyurethane sheet on my pour table and then started securing it down with some beams and wood clamps. For the resin dams on either end of the table, I used pieces of particle board that I trimmed to size, wrapped them in polypropylene tape, and then secured them with silicone to ensure that the resin won't leak out during the main pour. The silicone works great and can be easily removed afterwards. Because the first pour is going to be over 2 inches, I'm using a deep pour resin that's a 2-to-1 mix. For the rustic copper, I'm using several different shades of pigments, including copper, gold, silver, and bronze. I start by pouring this base copper into the main river, but plan on coming back to add additional colors later on. Finding the right combination of colors to match the specific shade of metal can be a little tricky. There are a ton of options out there for colored pigments, and finding the exact one that's right for your resin pour just takes a little bit of experimenting beforehand. I mixed up half a dozen samples before committing to one recipe of colors for the main resin pour. After the first resin pour settled down, I went back and added in several auxiliary colors to get that rustic look for this copper. I decided to go with an aged copper look rather than patine, so I didn't bother adding in any green. After a few weeks of curing, I was able to pop it loose from the pour table and get it ready for surfacing. I neglected to capture it on video, but during the cure process, I added another 1/4 inch of clear resin to the very top of the river. This is why you're able to see those charred live edges so well. The polypropylene tape on the dams allow it to separate from the resin quite easily. The silicone comes off the resin and the polypropylene very easy as well, but it is a little rough to get off the wood. Sometimes I have to use a chisel to get it released. Lastly, I start driving in wood shims all around the table to break loose the resin from the polypropylene pour sheets. It doesn't take long to get most of it lifted, and then I just finish it off with a crowbar to pop the entire table loose from the polypropylene. I didn't pour the resin all the way to the top surface, so after this, it's on to surfacing to get to the right thickness that we want. My pour table wasn't exactly flat, so I used wood shims to prop up areas that might have a little bit of gap before starting the surfacing. By the time I finish, both sides will be completely flat. Surfacing a resin table takes a lot of patience. You have to go real slow and everything is calculated. Especially when you're trying to protect resin art under clear resin, you want to make sure that you don't take off too much in an area because removing that top portion of the resin art changes the whole look of the resin. For surfacing, I prefer to use a high RPM and go slow at it, only doing about a 50% step over line each time. If you try to remove too much at once or try to do a 90% step over, what happens sometimes is tear out, either on the wood or the resin. So to avoid that, just go slow and steady. Once the top was flattened, flipped it over and surfaced the bottom. I left the table slightly oversized on all edges, so I made my final trim cuts to clean those up. Generally, I make 2 passes, each 50%, cutting through all the edges, especially in the resin. I also use a fine-tooth blade to make all my cuts. The router surfacing blades leave small step-over lines across each surface of the table, but those are easily removed with 80 grit on a dual-action sander. First, I start with a direct drive and then move over to a random orbit that also has a little bit of direct drive built into it, which is why it's dual action. Following that, I move on to a 3mm random orbit sander with 120 grit, work my way all the way up to 400 grit dry sanding. Before applying a finish, I raise the grain using water after giving the wood and resin an air bath to remove any dust and particles. Then I follow it up by sanding again with 400 grit, followed by another air bath before applying the finish. I prefer to use a liquid hard wax, which brings out the natural color and beauty of the wood. It also leaves it a matte instead of a gloss look. It's great for hardwoods, not so great for softwoods. In total, I'll apply 3 to 4 coats of this finish, allowing it to cure in between, and then rescuffing it up with Scotch-Brite before applying the next coat. Wood finishes do help revitalize the sanded resin, but it's no magic cure to get it back to that high gloss state. What I do is I wait until all the coats have been applied, then I start wet sanding with oil to get that high gloss finish. I also follow it up with polishing with several different grits of compound. Wet sanding anything will test your patience, and resin is no different. It is a struggle to get it back to this high gloss finish, but I think it's worth all the effort because you get that contrast between the matte wood and the high gloss resin. Once I'm finished polishing out the resin, I go back and add one last coat of the wood finish across the entire surface and just wipe off any excess off of the resin using a soft microfiber towel not to scratch it. I really enjoy how the charred live edges turned out on this. It makes it stand out, gives it that real dark outline with the rustic copper. I have worked with charred live edges before, but with only transparent resin and never a solid pigment pour, so it was fun to see how this one turned out. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing any comments or questions you have about making this table. My name is Jeremy Elkins with Untreated Art, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel at Jeremy Elkins for future videos.